Welcome to Season 3 of This Is Your Life in Silicon Valley, a podcast about the Bay Area, technology, and culture. I'm your host, Sunil Rajaraman, and I'm joined by my co-host, Yasha Kakis-Wolf.
Hey, Sunil, do you have a favorite subscription newsletter that you get every day?
I have to admit, I don't have any subscription newsletters, but if I did subscribe to one, it would be our guests today.
NextDraft is legitimately, Sunil, my favorite newsletter. And I've subscribed to it for years now, but something pretty different has started to happen with NextDraft over the course of the last few years. And that really specifically is that kind of a technology and news, kind of interesting news, pop culture news newsletter has turned into something that's a lot more political. And I think we're seeing that maybe more and more.
So, it is pretty interesting. And I've been aware of NextDraft for a while, but our guest today, Dave Pell, who I first came to know of on Twitter. Actually, he's pretty profound with his views, and he's not afraid to put himself out there. And like you said, the newsletter really, it sounds like, reflects some of those views and some of the candor that he exhibits today.
Dave is an investor, writer, publisher, and he's also a Bay Area native. I think he's a really interesting example for us that are in tech to look at when we're trying to consider what we might do if we want to adjust our platform to be in tune with the times politically. We hope you enjoyed today's conversation. We definitely did. Dave, thanks for taking time on this Friday afternoon to do the podcast with us. We appreciate you being here.
Great to talk to you guys. Great to have contact with anybody from the outside world during this quarantine period.
Have you left your house at all?
I do leave my house. I've been saying since basically the third day of quarantine that there's a much higher probability of my kids killing me than the virus killing me. So almost any excuse to get out of the house, whether it's going to the grocery store or just walking the dogs or faking an errand, I'm taking it. So I get out, but I don't shower much and I don't interact with others much.
Except on Twitter. But that doesn't really count though, right? Nobody can tell that you haven't showered.
They can't tell I haven't showered, and I really never read what anybody else says there anyway. That's the pro tip for the day.
Are you a Bay Area native?
Yeah, I grew up on the mean streets of San Rafael, just north of the Golden Gate Bridge. And I'm, aside from a couple years, maybe 3 years in New York and 1 year in Cambridge, outside of Boston, I'm a lifelong Bay Area resident.
Honestly, I think, Sunil, what have we done, like 50 plus recordings? Dave, you might be like the fifth or sixth person who's a Bay Area native that we've talked to.
Yeah, it's a cool experience actually in terms of what you guys are focused on, sort of life in the Silicon Valley and life in tech. Both my wife and I were living away from the Bay Area right before sort of enhanced CDs and CD-ROMs took off, and we both moved home at the same time. And it's been pretty wild to see this sort of technology boom erupt and, blow up around us and then erupt again. It's been cool to have a front row seat. It's not quite as fun anymore, but in those first few years of technology, it was fun to see all the excitement happening right in our backyard.
Well, I totally want to get back to the not anymore fun comment, but I'm really curious about being a Bay Area native, and you said you left for a few years, but was this a place that you loved growing up? Was it a cool place to be a young person?
Yeah, I liked it a lot. I mean, growing up in Marin, it was definitely a lot different than it is today. It was always sort of considered sort of a wealthy community with, back when I was growing up, we were sort of known for peacock feathers and hot tubs and cocaine, and a few pretty amazing rock and roll bands lived in Marin, from Santana to Journey to Grateful Dead. And so that was always cool, and it was a cool place. It was a much more diverse place back then, for sure. Mm-hmm. The main way that it was really more diverse is that I went to a public school, but just in general, the people you hung out with, some of their parents were investors, some were tycoons, and some were, worked at the local bookshop or owned a little store. It was a pretty wide variety of people. And so we really didn't think about the stuff that sort of has hit Marin now. I find now Marin, there's a pretty tense conflict between the people who have lived here their whole lives and feel like they're sort of being forced out by the higher prices, and the people moving out from San Francisco largely in tech, but it's not just tech. It's, I think, representative of the divide that we're seeing all across the country. But I've had a few experiences definitely in Marin over the last few years where I've heard from people about those tensions, and it's sad to see for sure.
Was the Marin area, like, I guess, was it what you felt like it should be back then? Now, let me say it a little bit different way. Marin had this very idealized kind of view from the outside, and think about the kind of protests that happened here, even the creation of the malt here in the Marin area. Like, there's so many progressive things that have happened here. Do you still feel like that view of kind of progressive Marin exists today? Is that a part of the change that you're seeing, or is Marin, well, actually, let me just flat out lay it out there. Like, is Marin still an ideal place to be?
Well, I think in some ways it's ideal in terms of the level of beauty, the incredible weather, the smart people. Some of those things I don't think you can find anywhere else in the world. I mean, when I take my family on a vacation around the world, no matter where we go, me and my wife always say, it's hard to really be shocked by beauty when you live in the San Francisco Bay Area. On the other hand, there's definitely been an economic change in Marin that's pretty dramatic since I was a kid. But the idea of it being this sort of very liberal, wholesome place, I think that exists politically, but in terms of actual interaction, I think it's probably a little overstated even when I was a kid. I mean, BART goes a lot of places in our rapid transit system out here in the Bay Area. It goes a lot of places in the Bay Area, but it doesn't go to Marin. And even as a kid, I knew the reason that Marin voted down BART was not because it would get Marin residents to other places in the Bay Area. It was because it would bring other people in the Bay Area to Marin. And so a lot of the same racial issues deep down under the surface, under the political statements and the sort of loud liberal statements that exist everywhere in the country also exist in Marin. We might not vote that way, but unconsciously at least, it's still there. There's still not a good enough mix. Right now I live one highway exit from Marin City, and there's really not much more interaction with the kids from Marin City today.
One thing that I'll say is I think the only brown person in the conversation today, and we're having a week where we've had a pretty intense week as a country. And I'll say this, right, I know this is not a podcast about Marin, but both of you happen to live there and we're on the subject. Just my perception, I have definitely thought about moving to Marin at various points in the past, but, am I wrong for saying that I feel like my perception is that it's too white?
Well, I definitely wouldn't say that your perception is wrong. If you feel that way, then, it's probably real. I would say that there's an incredible variety of people here and a variety of not only political opinions, but personal behaviors. I mean, my wife is Samoan, so my kids are brown. I'm the only white guy in my family. I live with my mother-in-law also. A few years ago when my nephew graduated from Brown and I was in the student store during his graduation at Brown University, I saw they had some hats that said Brown Dad. And so I bought one of those and wore it home, and I always wear it around the house to try to fit in a little bit more around my own house. So this is an issue, definitely multiculturalism that is both in my house and in my life on a constant basis. There is mixing, and there are good things happening if you seek it out. And earlier this week, actually, for one of the few times I actually really did leave the house and go into a crowd, a friend of mine put on a protest in Marin City, a Black Lives Matter protest, protesting the police treatment of African Americans and the George Floyd incident. And it was an incredible mixture of people from all walks of life and all different races, ethnicities, and cultures and genders, kids, elderly people. And it really was great. And of all the years I've been a parent in Marin, which is definitely different than being a kid here, the best experience I've had so far is there's a dad at my son's school in Corte Madera that helped start the Marin City CYO basketball program. And so about half the kids on the team that my son has been on each year live in Marin City, and about half the kids go to the private school in Corte Madera. And that diversity and mixture of all the kids and families on the team has been like a great experience from kids from all of the different neighborhoods. And it's been a great way for us to learn about each other. It's why I know the guy who put on the rally in Marin City, why I was there. And it's just been great to see the communities come together. But an effort definitely has to be made. I know people personally that live in Marin who wanted to go to that rally but felt afraid to go there because of these stereotypes that are so ingrained in people. So I don't know that Marin is really, I don't think it's that much different than anywhere else in the Bay Area in this way, but it is definitely an example of one of those places where people speak liberal but act a different way.
Yeah, totally. There is a lot of that in Bay Area and tech in general. I want to get into that a little bit later, but one thing, and the reason that we brought you on is, about the news. If there is one thing that we can say about you, you understand news and information and how it's distributed. I first came to know you just randomly finding you on Twitter as kind of one of the preferred people that I follow that you should follow in technology, and you always have something interesting to say, whether I agree or anyone agrees or not. No one can deny that you're a very interesting guy. What's your take on the current state of media? Are you optimistic, pessimistic? Give us your assessment. Grade the media for us.
Yeah, there's almost nothing that I'm terribly optimistic about right now. This is I think a pretty low point in American culture in general. The media is certainly part of that. The hammering down of the media by Trump has, to us, might seem laughable or might seem dangerous. But as we've seen over the last week of the responses to the protests, some people see it as a marching order. And there's been so many people in the media who have been hurt or arrested, even on camera, by police in the last week. It just shows you how ingrained this message is and how receptive people are to the media as being the enemy of the people. That's more of a Trump answer. On the media itself, I think the biggest problem that the media had during the Trump's rise to power was their obsession with him and their failure to see how much danger he represented. And therefore, they gave him an unbelievable amount of coverage time compared to Hillary or any other topic, really. I mean, if you look at cable news today, it's 100% Trump 24/7. Fox and MSNBC and CNN don't have much in common except that one thing. All they cover is Trump 24/7. So I see that happening again to a certain extent. I see 59 minutes on Trump's idiotic remarks about being aggressive or using the military against protesters on American soil. And then I see 1 minute of Biden making the opposite comment. And I think that's my biggest concern right now in the media, with the media, is that we're making the same mistake we made in 2016. And in some ways, I think the pressure to keep it that way is even greater now, because in the last 3.5 years, there's been just a ton of people who have become media stars based almost exclusively around the Trump era. Like their entire brand is anti-Trump. And that, I think to a certain extent, that fame and that notoriety and that livelihood even goes away with Trump disappears, because people aren't going to want to listen to politics 24/7 if this ends in November, which we hope it will. So
I have a question on that. I want to drill in.
Sure.
Oh, I know. So we're doing this on Zoom to our listeners. We're having, Yasha and I make the joke now that we talk over each other. I won't rehash that joke for this episode, but my question is, you make a point, which is, I also see these stars being minted in conservative media because of Trump, essentially. What do you think about this sort of hypothesis? Just, so one thing that they've figured out, the conservative media, that, the quote unquote liberal media hasn't maybe figured out, is, we are really diligent on the liberal side about fact checking, getting things right, sources, et cetera. And, 99 stories can be right, but it's that one wrong one that you get killed for. On the other side, if you get one story right, like you throw a bunch of stuff out there, then it's marketed differently where, you look like an all-knowing genius if you get it right. Is that a good theory, or is that an incorrect theory?
I think it's a good theory, but it's based, I think, on a fallacy in your question, which is comparing Fox to liberal media. The whole reason why we have this discussion about conservative versus liberal media is a creation of Fox News. It is a creation of the alt-right on news sites and creating conspiracy theories on the internet. There's one media that is focused on fact. There's one media that is focused on the values of liberal democracy. And then there's another media that lies, is entertainment, and is about perpetuating falsehoods in order to keep one side in power and hopefully to keep their own ratings up. So this isn't to say that mainstream media doesn't care about ratings and money. I alluded to those factors already. But the whole idea that there's a liberal media and a conservative media is, I think, a falsehood. That's one of the biggest problems and one of the most effective tools that Fox and further right media outlets have created to their benefit and to the detriment of society as a whole. There's truth and there's lies. Those are the two types of media that I focus on. I don't take it that is somebody who's arguing that we shouldn't have troops come out and fire tear gas on our own communities. Is that a liberal position? No, that's a truth, and it's what democracy is based on. And we see generals coming out and supporting that position. So if anything, the mainstream media has been too soft on Trump because they're so concerned about not appearing liberal. It's created these false equivalencies that are damaging to our society as a whole. I think it should be taken out of the conversation completely. There's truth and there's lies, period.
How would you recommend somebody spend their time if they're not you, if they're not the editor of the internet and know where to look? Like, if you want to get good news, where do you go right now?
Well, I mean, for one thing, I would advise people not to get too swept up in it because it can be debilitating. It can be overwhelming. And there's nothing healthy about a society where all the citizens are spending 24 hours a day screaming at each other about politics, right? We're a representative democracy. We're not shouldn't all be in the pit 24/7 screaming at each other. We have much more in common than we have that separates us. So I would avoid it to a certain extent and let the addicts like me serve as sort of a filter. In terms of places where I would actually get news, I mean, the New York Times makes mistakes, but they've done an incredible job, I think, covering part of the last 3 years. The number one source I would say that's getting the story the most right over the last 3 years is The Atlantic. I think of all old school publications, The Atlantic in general has made the best transition to new media of any of them. And I just think that they've been right the most. If you had asked me this 3 years ago, I'd say maybe they're a little bit extreme about the threat that Trump represents, and maybe some of their views are a little out of the mainstream. But by this time last week, all doubts about that have been erased, and they really have been on the mark. So I would highly recommend that. I think the Washington Post has done a great job. I mean, all of it, of course, when it comes to the opinion columns, you have to read it with a grain of salt. But in terms of the actual news, I think they've done a pretty good job. And I know those are very mainstream publications and maybe not exactly what you were looking for, but I don't fault publications for being successful or mainstream. There's other publications that have done a great job, but I think you do get a good, well-rounded story from those. If anything, like I say, I think certain publications, if the Times has aired, it's been on being too forgiving of Trump and waiting too long to use the word lies. And you're going to see a dramatic shift in the next few months, not because the election's coming. That's what Trump will try to position it as. But the big shift actually is when Mattis and the other generals spoke out this week about the threat of using the military to put down protests in the United States. When you have people that are that hesitant to talk about the threat that we're facing, speak out in such forceful terms and really several of them together, you know that it's a serious situation. But that also gave a green light to people like the New York Times and the Washington Post to say, hey, maybe we should start calling this how we really see it and stop worrying about false equivalence.
Yeah. Have you always been a politically minded person?
I'm definitely have always been politically minded. My parents are both Holocaust survivors. So I grew up, our dinner conversation every night was anti-Semitism, news, and politics. And that's basically, my parents are in their 90s now, and it's pretty much continued to this day. Most everything my perspective on all these issues is really formed by their positions on them, especially my dad. I'm definitely, even though in this interview I probably sound like an extreme liberal, I'm actually, I'm an investor. I'm pro-capitalism. I consider myself a mainstream Democrat, not a far left necessarily. But I've always been politically minded. During the early days of the internet, I was actually one of the first bloggers to cover a Democratic convention. During the Kerry convention, they had 30 bloggers cover the convention, and I used to write a blog back in those days. In NextDraft, I really wanted to be apolitical and cover things from not a totally unpolitical realm, but at least not focus it on politics. Yeah. I wanted to focus on general news, but the last 3 years have forced me to do this. So I'm actually, NextDraft is not something I want it to be or I ever aspired for it to be. I get a lot of unsubscribes, I get a lot of hate mail, but I just think the situation right now is so dire and so serious that to pretend anything is not political today is a mistake.
So I think that's a super meaningful statement. And this was really one of the hearts, the question that I wanted to get to with you in this conversation. NextDraft didn't, at least my introduction to it and kind of what I fell in love with it for, wasn't because of the kind of bent on politics and kind of, it's become that. And I appreciate it. But I also look around the world who maybe have some people that represent themselves similarly to you, that have great newsletters and are considered to be experts in the news, and they haven't made the kind of the leap that you have. And you just said you had to do it. So I'm really curious about the calculus. Like, how do you take the general news and technology curation that you've been focusing on and make the transition into politics? Like, was it just natural for you? Did you think about it at all? Did you want to stop? Were you worried about doing it? Like, how did you get NextDraft to where it is right now? Why did it happen?
All right, so I'll give a three-part answer, but they'll all be short. The first part is that NextDraft, above all, has always been personality-driven. So NextDraft is what the day's most fascinating news, according to me. So it's my voice. It's what I find fascinating. It's not intended to be an exhaustive news source. It's sort of a modern day column. If the column as a forum was invented today, I think it would be a lot of takes with a few links. And that's what NextDraft is. So this is what's on my mind. So this is what's in NextDraft. The second issue is just pure mechanics. There is no other news right now. Even during this pandemic, I do get emails from people who like NextDraft and they've been readers for a long time. They say, can't you just take one day off from Trump and the pandemic and give us some other news? But I challenge anybody to go and find 10 stories in any given day that are not about one of those two topics right now. It's actually really hard. Everybody is on those stories. You look at some of the biggest stories that are broken about Trump, and they're broken by reporters who 3-4 years ago were on different beats, but now they're on the Trump beat because that is the story. The third reason really is that what I talked about earlier. I am the child of Holocaust survivors. Not my dad fought with the partisans. He's, I am here because he got a hold of a gun and was able to kill the right people before they killed him. He's far from a bleeding heart liberal. But when Trump started using the language that he used in the lead up to the 2016 election, my dad said, this guy sounds a lot like Hitler to me. And I said, yeah, but he's a big joke. Everybody laughs at Trump. He said, well, go back and look at the history of Hitler. Everybody made fun of him when he first started out too. And my dad wasn't being hysterical. He's the least hysterical guy in the world. He wasn't saying that this is going to be Europe in World War II, but he was saying that this language and this style did represent a threat that he saw. And, I took that seriously because he doesn't say those type of things lightly. And now my dad's 96, and every time I get together with him, he says, I never thought I'd live to see the day where fascism and anti-Semitism would rise to the level it was when I was a kid growing up. But today I see it as being as bad and in some ways even worse than it was when I was a kid. And this is a guy who lost his whole family in the Holocaust. He was one of only two people from his whole town to survive. So when he says that, I take it seriously. And because of that, and because I have the freedom to speak my mind, I don't have a brand that can tell me how to behave or what to say. I'm not financially dependent on NextDraft, so I can use it for what I want to use it for. And even though it doesn't always feel good to have it become this thing that's not universally loved, not that it ever was universally loved, but it was certainly uncontroversial before. To get into this controversy doesn't feel good, but I feel like considering what my parents sacrificed to give me the ability to do that, I owe it back to them and to people around me to say what I think is true, because I'm not just speaking for myself. I'm speaking for people who have seen it firsthand.
So I'm really curious to dig into this more. You sound like a person with a deep appreciation for history. And, if you had told me 6 months ago we were going to live through a global pandemic, I, would have laughed at you, and all sorts of stuff is happening that I had no idea would happen. But in your best guess, what is a worst case scenario right now? Describe a worst case and describe a best case. And I'll define it a little bit more. Worst case with election, best case with election, worst case with economy, best case with economy, and then similar for just social issues over the next, 12 to 18 months.
Yeah, those are tough questions, but I'll try. I would say, worst case for the pandemic is that these protests that have taken place understandably lead to massive outbreaks in the places where the curve was starting to flatten, like New York. And because it's already rising in other places of the country, and we've had a hard enough time stopping it from a national perspective, even when it was just in a few big cities, and now it's spreading to the south and other parts and small towns. So really, is the worst case with that is that it starts to spread, and it spreads to places that are much more ill-equipped to deal with it than the big cities who had a hard enough problem as it is. And the biggest problem associated with that is that the Trump administration has basically decided to pretend it's not happening anymore. They don't have press conferences on it anymore. It wasn't a winning issue for them. So they moved on to something that Trump sees as a much more winning issue, which is what he ran on: birtherism, racism, dividing people. So the big threat there is that focus on those topics and the absence of the federal government makes the pandemic 10x worse than it already is. And it already is probably 10x worse than it would have been with a decent administration. The economy, that's much harder to predict even than a once in a lifetime pandemic, I think, because we have such a bizarre divide right now where you have the stock market almost back to where it was at the beginning of the pandemic. And everybody I know, including investors, sitting back and saying, this doesn't make any sense, even with the Fed putting money into the system. What are people seeing? What are the positives out there that people are seeing? We have historically high unemployment. We have a huge divide. We have political unrest. We have America's role in the world diminishing. We have fights with China. We have terrible decisions being made. At every turn, basically, the worst case decision is being made by the administration. And yet the stock market keeps going up and bread lines keep getting longer. So the threat really is that the investor class becomes, has a feeling of ease about the current state, which makes it even more likely we won't do anything to help the people who are getting screwed over by the current state of affairs. So that's really my biggest worry, that, people who can work from home, people who can stay safe, will, and their stocks keep going up, and their businesses in the tech industry keeps getting bigger and making more money. And the people whose lives really depend on getting out there and doing their job in a growing economy and more fairness in the economy will continue to get more screwed over. And I think we're seeing that all along the line. So that's really my biggest worry about, is that election that
it's pretty dire.
Doesn't get counted. Yeah, I know. I'm not that optimistic, but I'm not saying these things will happen. I'm mostly focusing on the bad stuff. And the election, it would be that the votes don't get counted, or there's some dispute, he doesn't leave office, which is the most realistic scenario of all the ones I've described so far. On the flip side, just to show that I'm not, or to indicate my true feelings that I'm not so negative, with the pandemic, I've seen, even with a complete vacuum of almost anti-leadership at the top, I've seen unbelievable acts of leadership at the local, state levels, of individuals, of neighbors helping neighbors, of nurses helping patients, of people wearing masks, helping each other, delivering groceries to elderly people, neighbors coming together, working together. And it's even harder to do that stuff when you don't have that leadership from the top. So that's a really promising thing. Even though there's the threat of the pandemic, and even though we have this failed leadership at the top, we have these unbelievable multicultural protests going across 50 states. Like, people are more awake about these issues than ever before. And I think people realize for the first time in my lifetime that these gifts of liberal democracy and these gifts of freedom don't just happen. You have to work for them. It's a constant fight. I always come back to the MLK quote, "The arc of freedom bends towards justice." I like the idea of that quote, but I actually think it's a little off. It's the arc of, the arc of history. That the arc of history has to be bent. It doesn't bend towards justice. It has to be bent. And I think people.
So, sorry. Go ahead.
That.
Sorry. Keep.
I just think people forgot that.
I'm curious.
Bending it.
Yeah, no, and I really am enjoying seeing that. I mean, the events of this past week, though unfortunate, with the murder of George Floyd, really woke me up too, to just, having to take a basic sense of civic responsibility, take ownership over it, and contribute to the community in some way, because otherwise the community turns into something that you can't even recognize. That was a huge realization for me. I was going to ask you, and then I know Yasha has a couple of wrap-up questions, but who do you think, you study the news, you see a lot of people, who is the most important person that we haven't heard of if things are going to turn around? Is there a person that you would point to that is in politics or tech or any walk of life that you think, oh my gosh, a lot is riding on this individual or this group of very, very small people, and if they get it right, we're on a good trajectory?
Yeah, I actually do. It's a group of people, and that's corporate leaders. And the reason I say that is because I really think this was a watershed week, with Mattis and the other generals finally speaking out. What, of course, we all know they've thought since day one. But they were reticent to speak ill of a president for obvious reasons, but now they felt it went too far. But this week, you not only saw military leaders do that, you also saw religious leaders do that when Trump used the Bible as a prop in front of the St. John's Church in D.C. And so you're starting to have these huge, these leaders of these huge swaths of America speak out. And the one that you haven't really heard yet is corporate America. And I think in general, it's not that they don't agree with the philosophies being shared by the military or leaders right now, but it's because they feel like they need some safety in numbers. They don't want to be singled out. Trump has done a great job of scaring corporations by making negative tweets about them or getting his followers to threaten to boycott them. So people sort of want to keep their heads down. But the time to keep our heads down really is over at this point. So I'm hoping that somebody will be able to organize a group of corporate leaders to come out and say that this is not the way America is being run right now, is not appropriate. And I think that probably is the biggest shoe to drop if we're going to get the thing back on the right track by November.
Do you think that any particular companies are more important than others?
I think sort of big mainstream brands. I would say tech, because we're out here and we demand a lot from them, even though we've been let down quite a bit. But no, I think it's just big, huge name brands, Coke, Home Depot. Well, Home Depot won't, because that guy is a big Trump supporter, but just the huge brands that you see at the mall and in your supermarket.
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, they don't have to come out and say, hey, Trump is terrible. They just have to come out and celebrate the ideals of democracy and the ideals of America, which doesn't seem like that much to ask, but it turns out it is.
It doesn't seem like that too much to ask. Thank you for the time today, Dave. This has been a really important and good conversation. We appreciate it. We've got one last question for you, and we ask this to all of our guests. You spend a lot of time on Twitter and maybe other networks, but you don't have to say if you don't want. What we do want you to do is make a recommendation on an important follow on Twitter, maybe, and another network if you choose, that our listeners should pay attention to moving forward.
Sure. Yeah, I really only do Twitter. Twitter and Pornhub are my two sites of choice. So I'll keep the latter to myself. But I had a few that I would suggest on Twitter. One is a guy named Don Winslow, and he's a really great author. Wrote a trilogy about the cartels in Mexico, and about an American that was also working in the so-called war on drugs. And it's an unbelievable trilogy. His recent book also is called Broken. It's a book of short stories. He writes a lot about police and their relationship with the citizenry, which is pretty timely. But he's just a really smart guy and really tells it like it is. And he's very connected in the worlds of government and police, and he tells things how they are. And he's, I think, a very good follow. Another one is on Twitter, Sleeping Giants. And that's like a organization. It's really just one person, or one or two people, but they basically let brands know when their advertising is showing up adjacent to alt-right or even neo-Nazi material on the web. And they let them know about it. And a lot of times those brands are removing their ads. So they've been a big thorn in people like Steve Bannon's side. So they're great. For the pandemic stuff, Andy Slavitt is probably my favorite follow. And his stuff is now, he does these Twitter threads, and they're being republished on Medium every day. So you can find him there too if you just search for Andy Slavitt on Medium. That's actually the best place to read his Twitter threads on the pandemic. And he's really informative, both from your personal behavior stuff, what's safe, all the way to the macro level of the government response. And I actually worked with him in Medium to get those tweet threads to a wider audience. Two others, Soledad O'Brien is really excellent because she holds the media, the mainstream media's foot to the fire in terms of what kind of headlines they choose and false equivalency, and if they're being honest enough, and if they're calling a lie. And then the last one is more fun. This guy named Billy Corbin, who people may have seen his documentaries. Cocaine Cowboys was, I think, his first big one. He did one on steroids in baseball called Screwball. And he's done a few of the 30 for 30s on ESPN. And I love following him because he lives in Miami and he constantly tweets about weird and bizarre things happening in Miami. And he ends almost all those tweets with just two words, because Miami. And I just get a kick out of it and find it fun to follow him. So that's a fun one. Our interview has been pretty serious, but really 99% of my life is joking around. So it's a strange time. So I guess we had to focus on those important issues, but I like the funny stuff also.
We appreciate that. I really appreciate you being with us today, Dave. Thank you very much.
Well, yeah, this is awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Sunil, did that conversation, maybe just at the beginning of it, make you want to move to Marin?
That conversation makes me want to take a long nap and watch a Disney movie.
It's sometimes tough to have conversations that are about kind of the truth about what's really happening. And I appreciated the candor that Dave had. I think he shows that in his public persona as well, but it's super nice to be able to have a conversation with him and kind of just feel the earnestness in the way that he goes about putting together content that he thinks is going to be useful for people.
We have a lot of different types of guests on the podcast. Some of the interviews are funny. Some of them are lighthearted. I mean, if we were going to have a serious, topic discussion, he is the right person to have it with, and he's direct. He knows what he's talking about, and he has good perspective.
Thanks so much for joining us today. Thanks for listening to This Is Your Life in Silicon Valley. If you enjoyed listening to this podcast as much as Sunil and I enjoyed recording it, please go back to the application you found this podcast on, rank us 5 stars, leave us a comment. We read every single one. Thanks for listening to This Is Your Life in Silicon Valley.